Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Athar Siddiqee. I am the current chairman of the Board of Trustees of the South Bay Islamic Association, SBIA, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Bay Muslim Media for putting on this very important panel discussion on the life of a great man, Dr. Martin Luther King, on this day, which is a federal holiday for him. And we're honored to have with us a very distinguished set of panelists this evening, all of whom I've had the pleasure of working very closely with for numerous years. Firstly, Imam Abdul Malik from the Oakland Islamic Community Center. He's a longtime Bay Area resident, member, leader, and activist. Welcome, Imam.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair, brother. Alhamdulillah. Nice to see you.
Sister Zahra Billo, Executive Director of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and someone who's been on the front lines of the Muslim civil rights movement in America.
Assalamu alaikum.
Sister Zahra. And Dr. Hatem Bazian, a teaching professor in the Department of Near Eastern and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as a co-founder and professor of Zaytuna College, and a leading voice against Islamophobia, among numerous other causes. Welcome, Dr. Hatem.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
So Dr. Martin Luther King was really one of the people that inspired me and someone that I admired growing up in the 70s. And no, Sister Zahra, I don't mean the 1870s, I mean the 1970s. I'm quite that old. She always likes to tell me how old I am. Although Dr. King's life was cut short far too soon, not long after his 40th birthday, he made the most of those four decades, as evidenced by the fact that he continues to serve as a role model for so many people over 50 years later. Dr. King was an American Baptist minister and activist who became the most visible spokesperson and leader in the civil rights movement from 1955 until his death and assassination in 1968. And while many of us know about his remarkable I Have a Dream speech, his March on Washington, and significant efforts to establish the Civil Rights Act of 1964, his impact and influence went far beyond these activities. So I provided a sense of what Dr. King and his life meant to me. And now I'd like to turn to our panelists to ask them the very same question. Let's start with Imam Abdul Malik, and then we'll go on to our other panelists. Imam Abdul Malik, tell me what Dr. Martin Luther King's life meant to you.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Well, I like many Black youth, turned off to Martin Luther King in our earlier days, and what we turned off to was the sanitized version of Dr. King that they told us, and they only emphasized I have a dream and so on and so forth. They didn't talk about the late 60s Dr. King. And once we familiarize ourselves with the late 60s Dr. King, I mean, he was making statements that sounded exactly like Malcolm, literally. Once we familiarize ourselves with the late 60s Dr. King, he became not only more relevant to us, but our love for him really, really increased. And then we noticed, Brother Athar, that when we went back and looked at the history, that if you looked at the Black youth at the time, the so-called Black militants at the time, the Black Panthers and so on and so forth, they had respect for Dr. King. You know, they never denigrated him, so on and so forth. I remember there was a story where some of the Detroit police, during the rebellions in Detroit, some of the Detroit police were confused because they asked some of the young brothers who were rebelling, you know, who's your inspiration? This is late 60s. And they were shocked to hear them say Dr. King was their inspiration. So late 60s, Dr. King is extremely, extremely relevant. And there's so many things that we can learn from him that will help us deal with what we need to deal with today.
Perfect. Sister Zahra, the work that Dr. King did is certainly right up your alley. You're quite a bit younger than the rest of us, but I'm sure that his work influenced us, influenced you as well. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much to Bay Muslim Media for having tonight's event, and really Athar for moderating, Dr. Hatem and Ameer Abdul Malik. It's good to be in company with you. I grew up understanding him as a peacemaker, which really felt in conflict as I learned about what was happening to African Americans at that time. And so I know you've already said I joke about your age, but also, Amir Abdul Malik was someone that I looked to a lot when I was in college. And I remember him talking to us about how the image of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been sanitized over the years. It's telling that the FBI, the military, and Immigrations and Customs Enforcement today are posting tweets about how they love Dr. Martin Luther King when their very existence is the antithesis of what he taught us, what he advocated for. It's telling that so many of the quotes that we see in learning about him, really imply almost a tolerance for the abuse that Black Americans were facing at the time. And so as I relearned his history, that I think really helped me come of age as an activist, to say he was unpopular during his life. He was made popular by government and commercial entities after his life because they didn't want us to learn what he was really about. And so when I think about how we celebrate him now, I look to leaders in Oakland, for example, the Anti-Police Terror Project, who says rather than talking about his legacy of peace building, let's talk about him as a radical leader. Let's talk about him as a civil rights leader, as an anti-war leader, and let's reclaim his legacy.
Okay, great, thank you, Dr. Hatem.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I'm going to take maybe a completely different track, not in content, but track in terms of how MLK's contribution and work impacted me. I studied speech and communication, and I was actually part of the speech team. And part of the work that we actually undertake is to actually examine what we call great speeches of the era and great speeches of leaders throughout, whether it's in the US or across the world. And for me, MLK speeches next to Malcolm X, you could actually see the genius of oratory and the structure of the language that is used. Almost every aspect of rhetoric, every aspect of the structure of speech, using analogies, using all types of tools, bringing examples in such a way that connects MLK's speech to his audience, as well as take them with him, both at the highs and the lows, in a really one of the most genius ways in relations to speech making and speech writing. And if we read his speeches, and again, one of the speeches that I almost, I don't want to say weekly, but almost monthly, I revisit, is his speech, The Three Evils of Society. Mm-hmm. That he gave in August 31st, 1967. I think if you study that speech in terms of what Martin Luther King said at that time, I would say that any individual today that they say that they are radical, they just really, if they read that speech and understand what Martin Luther King was saying at that time, can relate to why the majority of America in 1967 considered Martin Luther King as almost enemy number one, that 70% of the American public was against MLK. The major newspapers wrote editorials against him, including the mainstream Black press that saw MLK departing from the mainstream, the president's support of the Vietnam War, and basically beginning to be transnational because he began to speak about the internal colonial and the external colonial. And for me, that speech really should be studied, reanalyzed, reconsidered, and rethought. You might update only the amounts of money that he referenced, but not the exact content. And that is, I think, what it would be from just a speech making and the genius of rhetoric from MLK is just for us to really revisit those speeches of 67 and just 68 just before his death.
Imam Abdul Malik, did you want to counter or mention something in that regard?
I would like to amplify that point because that's so critical when he talked about the triple evils, right? Racism. And then you flash forward and we're dealing with the whole aspect of white supremacy. He talked about poverty. You flash forward and we're dealing with the whole aspect of this gap between the rich and the poor, right? He talked about militarism, which was an anti-imperialist position. And you look and see what's happening today, particularly in Muslim countries all over the world. So you check out those three evils that he mentioned, and you see that you flash forward to today, and you see we're still dealing with those three evils to this day. So it's extremely relevant. I really agree with what Dr. Hatem was pointed out.
Great, thank you. So it seems that during the time that he was alive, there were there was a different perception of him than afterward. I would say much in the same way that Malcolm X was viewed quite differently in retrospect versus at the time. What are some of the misconceptions that maybe some people who just know a little bit about Dr. King have about him that you'd like to clarify?
Who's that for?
Let's start with you.
That Dr. King was a radical. Dr. King was a revolutionary. Dr. King was anti-capitalist. Dr. King was anti-imperialist. Dr. King wanted to see a radical distribution of wealth in this country. Dr. King wanted to shut this entire country down. He was committed to nonviolence, but what he was committed to was massive civil disobedience. Dr. King literally wanted to shut down cities by shutting down freeways, shutting down airports, things that we're seeing today. What we saw at Ferguson and other places, right? So he said he was committed to nonviolence, but in the form of massive civil disobedience, shut everything down. And so I think the biggest misconception, I think, is that is to gloss over the fact that he was radical, and he wanted to see a complete redistribution of wealth. And through that, he talked about this revolution of values, right? So I think that's, for me, that's like the main thing, like just doing away with his whole radical persona.
Gotcha. Sister Zahra, what about you? Were there some things maybe you have heard about him that when you delved more into his life, you realized, hey, you know what? That's not exactly accurate. Are you hearing her okay?
No, can't hear her.
Nope, thank you. Yes, okay. What gets me about Dr. King is that we perceive him, or we're told about him from one moment in time. One speech sets the framework for everything we are taught about him. His earlier sort of less radical views inform how we perceive him. And so the misconception that is important for me to get to is that he was changing and growing as a radical leader, as an activist. His positions got stronger, more robust, and more vociferous over time. But if we were to look at how we're taught about him in public schools, we only see really the early version of Dr. King.
Dr. Hatem, it was actually your comments that spurred this follow-up question. Do you have anything to add to that, or did you cover what you wanted?
I think in general, when we are speaking of leaders of this magnitude, we also have to look at it, the human dimension of it, but also the complexity of the individual at the time that they are in. And that's often the challenge of reading someone or examining someone 50 to 60 years thereafter. You're often looking from the present context into their time period, and you evaluate that. And I think what we need is to understand that this is the period of when MLK was leading in the civil rights movement. This was where lynching was an open phenomena. The KKK was still very active and present, where you could actually have police, local police, definitely in the South, was on the game, not dissimilar to some maybe on the fringes today, but they were running the show as such. So I often, when people say, well, Malcolm was far more radical than Martin, I think that becomes, in that sense, falling into the binary that was constructed to say that there is the good Muslim, bad Muslim of today. So there was the good black and the bad black, even though that both were actually are born out of the complexity and entanglements of the racist venture. I think they are just approaches with different strategies, but I don't think they differed on the vision of what they wanted both to accomplish or the complexity of the various civil rights activist leaders from that period even to the present.
I see. You know, the day before Dr. King was assassinated, he said in a speech in support of sanitation workers in Memphis, and I quote, paraphrase, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." So it seemed like he was prescient and cognizant of the fact that his life might be ended early. But I also got a sense of satisfaction that he felt some of his goals were achieved or on their way to being achieved. How do you think things would be different in America today had Dr. King lived for another 10, 15 years or more? Let's stick with Dr. Hatem and go in reverse order.
Well, if you think about every critical leader of the civil rights and the Black human rights movement has either been assassinated, put into jail, or sent to exile. This is the direct result of COINTELPRO. And then following that period, what you get is basically either you accept the deal that is there, that is given and so on, and you should accommodationist approach, or you're going to end up as one of those three categories. So rather than only thinking of MLK having 15, 20, or 30, or 50 years more, just think of all the Black bodies and brown bodies that have been either in the graves or are dead in jail because they are really dead in civil society, or are chased out from just living a normal life. And then we get what I call the plague that we still are confronting, the plague of racism, the plague of indifference, the plague of everyday violence that is committed against people for no other reason than having a different skin tone or having a different conceptualization of life. And I think that's what we need to confront. So whenever you look at the inner cities, and I know politicians, they use the inner city as a backdrop for their movie, which is called the Running for Office. Whatever you see in the inner city is a direct result of a long history. One could say 50 years, 70 years, one could say 500 years of this constant process of elimination of the best and the brightest that leads to the structural underdevelopment that we see. So that's how I would see where the loss of Martin Luther King should be located in this conversation.
Got it. Sister Zahra, Dr. King had really scratched the surface of what he could accomplish, much like Malcolm X certainly had much more that was on his plate. And of course, there were elements in society who were afraid of what they might accomplish. And so there are some that believe that, the individuals who were accused of murdering these two were in fact not truly the ones who did. So any comment on that, as well as what do you think he may have been able to accomplish had he had more time in his life?
I mean, I agree with Dr. Hatem is that we need to place the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X in the larger context of hundreds of years of white supremacy at the foundation of this country. We have a pattern and practice of executing young Black men, leaders and lay people. They have shorter life expectancies, and it's not because they get sick. It is because we literally murder them as communities and a country. What I wonder about the early death of young leaders, you're right, is what more could have been done, what vacuums in leadership could have been avoided. But I also think that as people of faith, we know that our time in this life is limited, and that our ability to accomplish things is pre-written. And so we keep working, knowing that what we're striving for is the effort, and the outcome is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hands. And so that too is the case here, is that him being killed creates the reality that there is this question of like, who's our next Malcolm X, who's our next Martin Luther King Jr., but also leaves open the path for so many of us to follow in his footsteps.
Imam Abdul Malik?
You took me back because I remember looking at that speech as a 9-year-old. I remember looking at that speech as a 9-year-old, and I got confused because it was after his death, but yet he's making this statement about his death. And so it confused me. Taking your question head on, the United States would be a different place. The type of influence that Dr. King was having among the youth and the poor. And when you're in the movement, if you have the youth and the poor, that's it. That's it. Those are the major entities. And Dr. King had the youth and the poor, although he didn't have the media. He didn't have most of the Christian churches behind him, but he had the youth and he had the poor. And he was going across racial lines. You know how Black people in this country, other people try to be like us. We influence other people in other races. We do that socially, politically too, not just in entertainment. And so Dr. King was showing that in terms of this tendency for Black people to influence other people along racial lines. He was doing that. And so when you look at this man, and I remember he was one of the speeches, he was in the pulpit teaching old Black people about imperialism, teaching old Black folks about imperialism. You know what I'm saying? And so the type of education he was giving us, the type of leadership he was giving us, Allahu Alam, but had he lived, America wouldn't have been the same America that it is today.
Okay. We as a nation seem to have made some great strides over the past few years with respect to numerous social issues, be it the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, etc. But clearly we still have a long way to go, as we've seen division, hateful rhetoric, etc., spewed out by the current administration, which is thankfully just a few days from ending, including last week's horrific attack on the U.S. Capitol. What do you think Dr. King would have said about some of these incidents that we've seen recently? Imam?
That part is easy in terms of what he would say about Donald Trump and things that were going on. That's easy. I think another question is what would he have said about Obama? Because I see these shirts with Malcolm, Martin, and Obama. You know what I'm saying? And real quick, one of the things that Dr. King gave us is that we have to use his analysis on things. And one of the things he talked about with Black politicians, and he said that Black politicians who are manufactured by the system, one, they expect Black people to vote for them only because of their color. Number two, they spend no time dealing with the Black community. Number three, they make no promises to the Black community. They have no program for the Black community. That was Obama. That was Obama. And so one of the things that we have to do is take what this man has said, take it, understand it, and apply it in our analysis. Because if we do that, we'll be able to understand things that are going on today. It would have been easy for him to break down what was happening in terms of with Trump. But what would he have done with Obama? He wouldn't have been pleased with Obama at all, bombing all the different countries and so on and so forth. So this was a man who could have been, he could have been the good leader, but he gave it all up. He gave it all up and stood on principle. And I think that's one of the testimonies, the type of man he was.
Well, that's a great point. And I know Zahra is champing at the bit to be able to speak on this topic because she has some strong opinions here. So Zahra, please let me know about your reaction to what Imam Malik Abdul Malik said.
I agree. I agree with everything Imam Abdul Malik said. My additional piece is, for me, the question is less what he would have said and more what he would have done.
Mm-hmm.
What I think about often is how comfortable we are, particularly second and third generation Arab and South Asian immigrant Muslims. We live in semi fear of hate crimes, but I don't know. I don't look over my shoulder worrying that someone is going to kill me. I have a roof over my head. I have food on the table. And even the sacrifices that I make as a full-time civil rights lawyer are minimal compared to what Dr. King called us to do. When was the last time I engaged in real, courageous civil disobedience? And so when I think about the moment that we're in, I believe that if Dr. King were still with us, we would all be in the streets more often. We would be shutting it down, as Imam Abdul Malik talked about, because we're not going to get real change by just talking about it or Facebooking or tweeting about it, or even, as generously as we might donate, that's not enough. Are we really pushing our limits? And that's what he called his community to do, and what I think we need now.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Hatem.
Again, expanding both on Zahra and Imam Abdul Malik, I would say the following, that the events that we are witnessing today can be analyzed of the coming of an end of the 1964 Civil Rights Pact, which had really gave birth to the affirmative action, the integration process, access to jobs, employment, but also had the Voting Rights Act, and then followed by the Immigration Reform of 1965. And it's very interesting that the Civil Rights Act and the three major gains of the civil rights movement came after the election of Kennedy, which was bringing hope that there'll be a different direction for the country. And he was assassinated based on some of the domestic consideration, also connected to foreign policy at the same time. So I would say MLK, if we're looking at the society today, is that it reopens some of the fundamental questions that America still have not been able to undo. And these, again, the three evils of society: racism, obscene materialism, and the materialism that MLK was speaking about in 1967 pales in comparison, where you have actually close to 2,000 plus individuals that have $4 trillion more wealth than the bottom 50% of our total population. And yes, we could say that we have made some progress, but if you started 500 miles back and you actually have made it 10 miles forward, that can't be seen as progress. That could be seen you just made the first step in the long journey toward equality, toward dignity, toward fairness, toward justice. And then militarism, the bombing of Vietnam at the time pales in comparison today, where we have an open-ended war, where the United States have deployed operations in 39% of the Earth's surface. Let me repeat, 39% of the Earth's surface, the United States has operation in it. And this is for me when I would say today we still analyze that we have really a spiritual death that we're experiencing in the society that has to be re-examined and reconfigured in order for us to reorient this massive ship that is heading toward an iceberg in relations to what we are facing. The last thing I would say is the following, that the Black community is the primary group that put Biden into the White House. So that has to be understood. They voted for him almost 90 to 92%. Every other group, including Muslims, which again, some of our brothers and sisters have voted Trump, right? And for whatever reason, and they rationalize it, well, he cut taxes, alhamdulillah. right? He said he did not create new wars, but he actually, if you don't report on a war, that does not mean he didn't actually continue to energize war. And again, he had it by proxy, whether it's in Yemen, in Libya, or other places. So again, the question for Biden and Harris and the Democrats is what type of actual meaningful, sustainable, and structural change that has to be seen, because if that change doesn't come, then you have to really be very careful from expanded hopes and aspirations that gets to be burst again by the Democrats. So the warning is to the Democrats and less to the Republicans, because we know that they all have what you call went to Macy's White Flower Parade in order to get many of their sheets for the insurrection. So I'm not worried about them in there. It is only the Democrats and where they are at this point, in order for to understand the Black community is what rescued the country again, and what is the country actually gonna do in order to bring about change.
Abdul Malik, looks like you are agreeing a lot to what Dr. Hatem said. Would you like to comment?
Oh yeah. Oh no. He hit it right there. He hit it right there. And you know what? Dr. King was he was adamant. He dealt with America as an empire. And this is the elephant in the living room that we have a tendency not to deal with. When people say, wow, we're still dealing with the same problems. Well, America is still an empire. And as long as America is an empire, we're still going to be dealing with these problems. And so, as I said, we can't underestimate just how significant that is to be up there from the pulpit and teaching old Black folks about empire, about imperialism, because this is what this all really comes down to. It really does. I would really suggest that we read the book First Flag, about when the United States decided February 6, 1899, when they decided to become an empire. And that's what Dr. King was teaching us, the nature of empire and what it does. And that's why he was calling for a radical, not just a radical distribution of wealth, but a radical revolution in values. Dr. Hatem talked about the spiritual doom. He said, if a country puts more money in military as opposed to social uplift, they're going to head towards spiritual death. And that's what we're dealing with right now.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I want to bring in one of the questions we have from someone who is listening in. And the question was, what are your thoughts on the significance of Dr. King's assassination 1 year to the day after his quote unquote after Vietnam speech at Riverside Church? Imam?
For black leaders, particularly for Black male leaders, there's a point that you get to that if you cross the line, you're a dead man. There are numerous Black leaders today, I'm not going to name names, who came to that point and stopped. When Dr. King took a position, an anti-imperialist position, in this case against the Vietnam War, he crossed the line. He crossed the line. He was a dead man. He internationalized, which is what Malcolm was talking about, of course, and the war was just fracturing the country. And this was in many respects, a very well-known leader, very well known. And he took an anti-imperialist position against Vietnam. He internationalized. He crossed the line. He crossed the line. So therefore, he knew from that point that he was a dead man.
So Zahra, anything you'd like to add? Dr. Hatem?
Many of the mainstream leaders begged MLK not to oppose the president on Vietnam. And his breaking with the president, in essence, he was taking a position against the US government at a time at the height of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. Because this also was connected to the anti-colonial struggle that was taking place and the mass mobilization against the Vietnam War in the Third World, but also in parts of Europe. So you had a very strong anti-colonial movement developing in France, where the Black movement in the United States was an inspiration to them. You had a Black movement developing in the UK, in Liverpool, in Birmingham, in other places. So those connections were there. So he was not only opposing the Vietnam War, he is putting himself within the third world transnational perspective. And that from that moment, he was, in essence, to be eliminated, because his standing as being a Nobel Prize winner represents the moral, ethical compass for the internally colonized in the US. And the US is standing and saying that we are fighting the war in Vietnam for freedom. And everybody knew that it had nothing to do with anything for freedom or democracy. And so that's, I think, is very important. And that's why he was actually opposed. 70% of the American public was against MLK. And that's very, very important, because we don't locate the individuals in the period. We are celebrating MLK, but that celebration has to be understood. Actually, earlier today, MLK's daughter put actually on her tweet that many of those individuals that are celebrating and speaking about her father would been the ones that were opposing him at the time, had he been also there today. So don't tell me about my father.
Right. That's right.
So that's
right.
very significant, just to understand the context. I think some of the individuals went out to speak about MLK. They would have been in the protest against him at the time, just like possibly today they were in the protest against counting the votes.
Sure, and in much the same way that
Yes.
Muhammad Ali.
And you know what? Exactly. And see, one of the things to remember, it was the Black youth who pushed Dr. King to take that position. It was the Black youth, including Muhammad Ali and H. Rap Brown and now Imam Jamil and Stokely Carmichael and so on and so forth. It was the Black youth who actually pushed Dr. King to take that position.
That's right. Yeah, and sometimes history changes our perception of people. I was about to talk about Muhammad Ali, who famously said, "I ain't got no problem with no Viet Cong." Went to jail for it at the height of his athletic prowess, and is arguably the most popular individual in the world until his recent passing.
Exactly.
So amazing how time contextualizes everything.
Yes.
Zahra, anything you'd like to add to what we've been discussing?
No, I think you're just continuing to drive home the point for me about the risks that these leaders were willing to take for their values, right? Personal and professional risks. So earlier I talked about personal risks as, are we willing to really participate in shutting it down, or do we just talk about it? But then even in the case of Muhammad Ali, professional risk, right? To say I'm going to sacrifice my entire career because I want to call out this hypocrisy and I will not be party to imperialism and racism and classism. And when we study Martin Luther King Jr., we do it really like a whitewashed version of him, and we do it once a year to make ourselves feel good about having participated in the federal holiday that, again, the military is tweeting about today. But are we willing to take the risks that him and his supporters were at that time?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another question that we have from the audience is, as American Muslims, how important is Dr. King's legacy to our next generation? What are 3 things about MLK we should teach our kids? Dr. Hatem?
One is that he took his faith seriously. The civil rights movement was born out of the church, the Black church in particular, which from the I would say the beginning of the 18th century has been the focal point of mounted resistance against slavery, Jim Crow, and also the civil rights. So faith as a base of transformative change is what we need to take from MLK. Second is that he led by example, meaning that he went out and was on the front line. With his own strategies, meaning that he had debates with other leaders. So I'm not saying that there was only one strategy, but he actually was out there and not theorizing, but actually engaging in putting what you call his shoes to the pavement and walking the talk. So that's the second is deep faith articulated in what you call actions to bring about transformation. The third, which I think has to be taken, is to be courageous, because one of the most difficult thing is to actually be courageous when it counts. And in this sense, he was very courageous, because it would have been easy in 67, 68. He already has won the Nobel Peace Prize. He would have, taken into retirement and did the lecture circuit and maybe wrote a couple of books and possibly got an appointment as a professor teaching what you call the glory days, not to speak about myself, but in essence, those would have been available for him as such. But it's courage that made him to actually take on not only on the government, but actually to step forth against the president at the most critical period in the history of the country. So he knew the threat, he knew the struggles, and knew everything. So I think those are the three lessons I would take for Muslims, especially we're continuing to what you call be sold an integrationist type of discourse, where we're so happy and delighted that somebody says, "Oh, assalamu alaikum," right, distorted as it is, and I like your falafels, and I love, samosa, and that's it. We think that they already love us, while at the same time are surveilling us, sending spies into the mosque, getting CVE, giving grants for people to study us, FBI agents to map our communities, and all of this. And we are being sold a similar type of platform. So I think those are, for me, the three foundations that we could take at least from MLK as a lesson.
Three excellent points. Sister Zahra, do you have a few you'd like to add?
Yeah, some of mine are similar. The first is that he put his faith into action. So for Dr. King, faith wasn't just go to church, sit in the sermon, give the sermon, do some of the outward rituals, but it really was about embodying the values that he believed in on earth, advocating for justice, advocating for poor people, advocating against war and racism. And I think about that a lot in the context of the Muslim community. It's important that we pray 5 times a day and that we fast and we pay zakat, but are we really willing to put our faith into action, to do the work to embody the values and to realize those values? So that's the first. The second is, to Dr. Hatem's point, he was courageous. There is something to be said about knowing that your life is at risk and that you are going up against the most powerful people and institutions in the world. They will do anything to preserve themselves, and you're still going to fight them. That, to me, is the embodiment of really trusting in Allah and knowing that no harm will come to us unless Allah wills it. And so to stand in the face of that power and say, I'm still going to fight back. And then the third, and I think this one might be especially important for young people, is to remind ourselves that he was unpopular during his life. Mm-hmm. And so doing the right thing does not always win us favors or credibility or awards. And those things are nice when they come, but they are not guaranteed. And sometimes how unpopular you are may actually be the indicator of whether or not you are on the right path. And so people may not like us for what we do when we are advocating for our faith in action, or when we are being courageous. But really, what we're looking for is not popularity, but justice.
Thank you, Sister Zahra. Faith in action. That would make an excellent theme for a banquet. Imam Abdul, Malik, do you have some 3 lessons you'd like to share?
One is that how Dr. King felt like no matter what our economic standing is, middle class, upper middle class, whatever the case may be, identify with the poor. Identify with the poor. And then based on that identification with the poor, that we also live a life of service, being of service to others, particularly focusing on the poor and, of course, the oppressed. The other thing is, when he talked about a radical change in values, stop focusing so much on wealth and acquiring wealth. And I got to get that job. I got to get that job because that job I'll make a lot of money. Stop doing that. I'm not saying, and he wasn't saying don't get educated. He wasn't saying anything like that. But what he was saying was that don't put so much into acquisition of wealth that you forget about your identification with the poor and being of service, right? And then thirdly, his willingness to sacrifice. That this man started college at 15 years old. He had his PhD by the time he was 26. He could have chilled and been a mainstream leader. He sacrificed that. He wasn't in love with wealth. He was not in love with wealth because they tried to buy him off. They couldn't buy him off. And then they tried to scare him in terms of his death. And he was willing to sacrifice his life, right? Like any man, I would like to live a long life, he said. Longevity has its place, right? But he's not worried about that now. Athar read that earlier. So he was willing to sacrifice. And so I think those are the things that really stand out.
Excellent points. You brought up a few things that I'm not sure a lot of people know. One was that he was very intelligent and brilliant, actually, and began high school at age 15. Actually, skipped
began college.
12th grade. I'm sorry,
yeah,
college.
yeah, exactly.
Skipped the 9th and 12th grade.
Yeah.
A few other things I learned is at age 6, one of his white playmates announced that he was no longer allowed to play with him because the schools were segregated at the time. So the parents of the white child said he could no longer play with him. The child himself, of course, had no issue. It was the parents that were doing it. As we all know, children don't see color. Another thing I learned was at age 15, he spent some time in Connecticut where there was not racial segregation. And that only further deepened his hatred of segregation. Another thing that I don't know that many people know is that he was actually incarcerated 29 times. So as you all spoke about, the enormous sacrifices one has to make, but one who is courageous enough to make when they truly believe in a cause, I think really to me stood out how important this cause was to him. We're not a whole lot of time left here, but let's get to one other question that has come up. Imam, while we're with you, let's stick with you. And the point is that I feel the Islamic diaspora in America is fractured, not as Dr. King would wish. What steps need to be taken today to elevate and combine the consciousness of South Asian, Black, Arab, etc., and other Muslims in America?
Letting the children lead. Letting the children lead. And the young adults. Listen to what they're saying. Because the children of these communities, the children of immigrants, have always played the role of being the bridge and the connector between the so-called immigrant Muslims and the indigenous Muslims. They have been playing that role for years. Years they've been playing that role. And we should recognize them in that role, embrace them in that role, and learn from that role. I can name so many instances in which these communities have been brought together because of the children of immigrants, and they need to step up. Our youth need to step up and do even more in terms of helping that come about. You are in that category. You know what I'm saying? You're in that category. You all been playing that role for years. You know what I'm saying? And so that just needs to continue. You know, the fact that we can have a discussion like this quality right here, is indicative of you all's background and the role that you guys have always played. You know, not to throw dust in your faces, nothing like that, but we have to continue that process, a continuation of that process of having the children of immigrants to bring both communities together.
I'm just happy you mentioned me and youth in the same sentence. Sister Zahra, what about you?
It was really difficult to keep a straight face when he did that. And so I appreciate his generosity telling you young people. I would say that speaking as a daughter of immigrants, one of the key things that we need to see and do in immigrant communities is really identify white supremacy as something that has impacted our own migration stories, our experiences in first and second generation families in terms of seeking out the opportunity to be model minorities and being complicit at times in anti-Black racism. and then understanding how many systems it impacts. Like, there is a reason that when we go into mosques in Silicon Valley, we don't see Black Muslims. It's because they've been pushed out of these parts of our country. There's something really jarring about seeing police departments modeling their police cars and taking children on tours at mosques, right? So there are so many insidious ways in which white supremacy impacts our everyday lives, and in which, again, first, second, and really even third generation South Asian and Arab immigrant families and communities are complicit. And so how we bring people together, I think, is to identify the root of the problems, because that's what it's going to take. That's step one, arguably, towards solidarity in an interracial way in our community.
Excellent. Dr. Hatem, you see the question there?
Yeah. I think for me, one is we have to articulate what is our vision and epistemology as a community in America. And I think for many, I would say in particular among the immigrant community, for us, America is in an aspiration to reach the white city upon the hill and never to mix with the darker part of America that is in the valley. And as such, the American dream is articulated around a construction of whiteness. And that process begins to really be internalized. I always say that we are using a mental Fair and Lovely in our thoughts. And that process begins to really eat at your vision and understanding of Islam. So Islam becomes articulated really around a cleansed version of white supremacy in how we see it, as well as a particular reading of it in a Christian theological terminology. So that basic understanding has to be in there, because a community that does not understand itself and the meanings that it has can't really progress. And as such, we need to take that step in a very deliberate, systematic way. I do think there's been a progress possibly in the past 6 to 8 months as a result of both the George Floyd protests and almost it was an iconoclastic type of demolition that took place. And I think as a result of this, there are people that are trying to locate themselves, which by asking questions, by trying to investigate and explore. And I think our role at this particular time is to make it possible for that consciousness to emerge, which is how to conceive of both Islam outside of white supremacist conceptualization, outside of a colonial lens, outside of materialism, outside of racism, outside of just wanting your cubicle in the 10th floor of a window outlooking the bay and you think that you have made it, but all what you are is a clog in a machine that's sending weapons of mass destruction across the world. That is the fundamental question that Muslims, whether it's Muslims, immigrants, Black Muslims, Muslims of whichever stripe, that they have to contend with. Because you cannot be here in America and just what you call think that you're on a Disneyland fairy tale ride and you're just gonna go to the section of what you call that looks at the Pirates of the Caribbean or the Alibaba section and so on without asking those fundamental questions. That for me is what needs to be articulated within our Islamic settings, which requires an educational enterprise. And when I speak about educational enterprise, I'm not speaking about you sitting in a class in an educational enterprise where just wudu and tahara and so on are the only thing we give, and there's no analysis of what is taking place. In essence, we begin to create individuals that are not really educated to be part of the world to transform it. I feel that we have to transform the world, and the only way for you to transform the world is by understanding the world that you're trying to transform. And for me, those are the questions that we're in America for a particular purpose. And that particular purpose is to bring about transformation to the better. Because if Martin Luther King says that we are reaching a spiritual death, we have to bring spiritual awakening that will transform society. For me, though, that's what is at a critical question.
Great. Final thoughts. 60 seconds. Please limit to no more than 60 seconds. Dr. Hatem, just to recap, anything we didn't mention about Dr. King that you'd like to wrap up with?
What I would wrap up, please take the time to go and listen to Martin Luther King's speech, Three Evils of Society, and Silence is Complicity, which is his break with the Vietnam War. If you don't do anything, just take the time to listen to those three speeches and then read them, because I think there's an element of impact to listening to his voice, but also to go through and read those two speeches. That's, for me, is one act of engaging the contribution of MLK today.
Great guidance. Sister Zahra.
Just reiterating the 3 takeaways. Put your faith into action, be courageous, and know that doing both of those things will sometimes facilitate your being unpopular.
Great. Imam Abdul, you kicked us off. Please help end us. You're on mute. You're on mute.
All right.
I'm pretty good at reading lips, but not that good.
Yeah. I was 9 years old, and I saw how the assassination devastated my mother and father. And that night, that little 9-year-old went upstairs, got down on his hands and knees, and prayed to God to let him become an FBI agent so that he could stop such tragedies. 11 years later, that 9-year-old was 20 years old and read the book, The FBI and Martin Luther King. And as soon as I read that book, The FBI and Martin Luther King, I thought about the 9-year-old praying to God to make him an FBI agent. And it was at that time that I understood clearly the relationship of Black people in this country. And so his life and his death had a profound meaning for many of us. And so for that, that's one of the reasons that we keep on doing what we have to do. We keep on doing what we have to do. And like Brother Dr. Hatem said, we have to understand the environment that we're in. And that realization right there, the role of the FBI in his assassination, and that 9-year-old boy who wanted to be an FBI agent, that did it. That was clear for me in terms of what we have to do as a people and how this country really sees us.
Very well said, and excellent way to wrap up. I'd like to thank Sister Zahra Billo, Imam Abdul Ali, and Dr. Hatem Bazian for their insightful, informative, poignant, and really outstanding comments and thoughts today on this very important subject on the life of a great man, Dr. Martin Luther King. I'd like to thank Bay Muslim Media, especially Brother Nilam, for putting this event together. And I don't know how many of you are out there listening, but I'd like to thank all of you for taking an hour out of your busy day to join us today. I hope you found this session valuable, and I hope that you'll give your feedback to Bay Muslim Media so we can put together other events that will be to your liking. I'd like to end now at 8 o'clock. As an SBIA representative, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say you have 14 minutes until Imam Tahir's tafsir session at 8:15. Please join us for that. And once again, thank you all. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.